Okay, so now that we have the basic task list working inside of our Pomodoro extension, the next thing to do is to work on the actual timer feature. And that's going to require us to create a background script to use alarms and notifications in order to notify the user when the timer is up, and to ensure that the timer is always running and doesn't stop when we close the pop-up. So to begin doing that, let's head back to our manifest file, and we'll add in more permissions. We'll need alarms, and we'll need notifications. And then we'll also need to set up our background script, or our service worker. So we'll add the background field in and pass in background.js as our service worker. Cool. And we still have to create this, so let's create a new file, call it background.js. And inside we'll begin, similar to our previous section, we'll begin just by creating our alarm. So we'll do chrome.alarms.create. And actually we have the API reference open here. So we'll pass in a name and then some alarm info. So we'll just call this Pomodoro timer. And the alarm info object, the only field we need to worry about is period in minutes. And we'll do 1 divided by 60 again, which is 1 second. Okay, so in order to make sure that this alarm is working, we should add in a listener. So from .alarms.onAlarm.add listener, and then it returns an alarm info object. So inside of the callback, you can double check onAlarm returns an alarm with name, period in minutes, scheduled time. And we only need to worry about the name to make sure that we're listening to the correct alarm. So we'll do an if alarm.name equals Pomodoro timer. Then we're going to do a bunch of things. The question being is, how do we actually want to store the information for the timer? Well, if we think back to our pop-up, what's probably going to happen is we want this to say at the beginning 25 minutes, which is the default time for your usual Pomodoro. And then it'll probably start counting down from 25 minutes to 24 minutes, 23 minutes, all the way down to 1 minute. And then when it hits 0, we want to send a notification to the user that the timer is up. And actually, in addition to that, we also have the start timer button, which can probably actually also use to pause the timer. And maybe we want to add in a reset timer function so that users don't have to wait out the full 25 minutes if they want to start a new session. And the first thing to keep in mind is we're definitely going to need a way to track the amount of time that has passed. So inside of our storage, we'll definitely need a timer variable. And also, in order to start and pause the timer, we're definitely going to need a variable to track that too. The first thing I'm going to do actually is inside of storage, we'll use local variables to track these things. I'm going to do a get. And we haven't actually created these variables yet, but by default, when our background script operates, it's going to do this get. And what we're going to do is set default values for these variables if they don't already exist. And if they do exist, we'll set them to be equal to what the retrieved values are. And this ensures that we don't have any buggy functionality where we have like null variables when trying to access these values, since the background script should always run this right at the start when the extension is installed. So we'll do a get on these. And remember, when we can't find these keys inside of the result object, these keys just won't exist. And the way to check if a key exists inside of an object in JavaScript is to do something like timer in res. And essentially, if this evaluates to true if there's a key timer inside of result, and false otherwise. So what we're going to do is chrome storage.local.set. So we have our timer variable, and we'll say if timer is in res, we'll do a ternary. If this is true, then we can just set timer equal to result.timer. Otherwise, we'll set it to a default value of 0. Same for this is running property. do is running in res, then we'll do res.isRunning. Otherwise, set to false. Now that we have the default value set up, what we want to do is actually access them inside of our listener. So we'll do a chrome.storage.local.get, just as we did below, in order to get the timer and get the isRunning value. And the first thing we want to check is if the timer is actually running. Because if the timer isn't running, then we don't actually want to increment this timer value. So since we know we have our default values set up and we know that these variables exist, we can just directly check it. So if result.isRunning, then create our timer variable and we'll set it equal to result.timer + 1. This essentially means that our timer variable is going to track the time of the timer in seconds, and we'll increment it by 1 every time this alarm goes off, since the alarm does have that period of 1 second. So once we have that value, what we'll want to do is update local storage with that value. So we'll set timer, and then we can save this. So now that this timer is running, we want to make sure that it's actually doing exactly what we think it's doing, and that we can access it from the pop-up. So what we should do next inside of our pop-up is implement the start timer button to actually set this isRunning value to true so that we can see the timer increment. So we'll head over to our pop-up and we'll begin by getting a reference to that start timer button. So we'll do a start timer button. So with the document, it's like get element by ID. And then we'll add an event listener. And this will be on click. And all it really needs to do is access local storage. That's set. And set that isRunning variable to be true. So we'll save that. And once that variable is set to true, we should start seeing this timer increment. And in order to make sure that it's working, we should do a console.log to see the values increment. Let's head over to our extension, and then I'll refresh this. If we inspect our service worker, we'll see that nothing's outputting. But then if I head over to the timer and I hit start timer, we'll see that the timer starts incrementing. But we don't really have a way to actually stop the timer right now, as you can see, because it only sets it to true. So that's probably the next thing that we want to work on. So what I think is when we hit the start timer button and the timer is actually running, well, then this button should change to a stop timer button or pause timer. We'll head back over to our pop-up, and what we should actually be doing is instead of setting isRunning to be always true, we should get the current value and then set it to be the opposite. So if the value of isRunning is currently true, we'll set it to false to pause the timer. And if it's false, we'll set it to true in order to restart the timer. We'll actually have to begin by retrieving it. So we'll do chrome.storage.local.get isRunning value. And then in the results, what we'll do is we'll move this in. We'll do this set. And all we have to do is actually negate res.isRunning. Since if it is running and we do a not, it'll set it to false. And if it's false, it'll set it to true. And then we'll actually want to do a callback after. And in this callback, what we're going to do is update the value of the start timer button. What we'll set the values to are dependent on what we set the new isRunning value to. If we set the isRunning value to true, then we should tell people to pause the timer. Otherwise, we'll tell them to start the timer. In order to do that, we'll do start timer button dot text content, and we can do a ternary again. We'll do if so not dot res dot is running is what the new value is. So if this new value is true, then we'll just say pause timer. Otherwise, we'll set it to start timer. We'll save this, refresh extension, and if we start timer, looks like we get a small error. Looks like it's a syntax error. Oh yes, there shouldn't be a comma here. So clear these errors, refresh. Start timer, pause timer. And it was a little out of sync because of the default value in the HTML, but it should be okay if you do a fresh install, since the start timer will reset to pause timer, and then it'll flip back and forth. So we shouldn't have to worry about that too much. If we start the timer, we can see this incrementing value. And if we pause the timer, we can see that it stops incrementing, which is perfect. So the next thing we'll want to do is implement our reset timer button. Since that should be a pretty simple change, we should just reset the value of our timer and set is running to equal to false. So inside of our pop-up, let's add in that button. We can just copy this button over, name it reset timer instead. We'll save this HTML, and right below here, do a reset timer button, and we'll do a document that get element by ID again. Set timer button, and we'll add an event listener, the on click, and inside of this callback, all we'll have to do is do chrome.storage.local.set, and we'll set timer back to 0, and we'll set is running to false. And what we also want to do in the callback is reset the text content inside of the start timer button. Since we know we're pausing the button, all we have to do is set the text content back to start timer. So we'll save this and refresh, and we'll inspect our service worker. So we can start our timer. We can see that this value is pretty big, and when we reset the timer, things are paused, and we can start the timer again, and this should start from 1. So we'll reset one more time. Notice how the value of this button changes, and we can start the timer from the beginning once again. So perfect. Looks like our buttons are working properly.